So it's really lovely that you're here. There's a number here. It's a long time, actually, since I've given a physical lecture. So I work at the University of Chester, and for the last 20 months, I have been sat in my little office in my home that's 6 foot by 6 foot, talking to a computer screen. So it is nice to see people and see friendly faces. So it's lovely. So we're going to talk about religious freedom in the UK tonight. And I just want to, and this is going to sound quite conceited, I'd just like to introduce myself a little bit so that you know where I'm coming from. And it's not just some random bloke off the street who decided to talk about religious freedom. And this is where I discovered that things have stopped working. Okay, so there's a few things on this screen about me, some of which are nice, and some of which link to tonight. So the most important thing about me, and it sounds terrible to call it a thing, is in the top left-hand corner. So that's my family. Okay, I'm married to Ruth. We have 4 children. Well, we have 5 because Ethan married Abby last year. Yeah, last year. So we now have 5 children. So they're all delightful. Gideon, who's on the end, who's our son, he's actually in Birmingham. Well, he's actually in Cardiff at the moment, fulfilling a mission for the church. He's supposed to be in Moscow, but because of COVID, he's ended up in Cardiff. The other thing that most people know about me when they first is I am a member of this church. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So there will be some elements that refer to that tonight, but generally speaking, I've tried to kind of do lots of different things. The building on the left was a place that I spent a very long time in because for 15 years, I think, somewhere around there, I was a teacher. So I taught religious education in secondary schools in and around Manchester. But for the last 13, I've worked at the University of Chester. And so there I'm an associate professor of religious education. And so I teach religions of the world. That's my job. I help students who are going to be teachers understand what it is to be religious and how to understand and how to teach other people how to do to understand other faiths. Other things, I support Macclesfield Football Club. It's only been about a year old because it went into liquidation and everything else. So it's, although it says since 1874, that's one of my vices. Other roles, I work for a company called EdExcel. So those of you who've done GCSEs or A-levels, I will probably have overseen their writing. So I'm in charge of the religious studies GCSEs and A-levels for all the different religions. Currently, I've written 2 books. The first one is Religious Education in the Secondary School, which is due to come out for its 2nd edition next year, and Beyond the Big 6 Religions, where I explore religions such as, let me think, Ahmadiyya Islam, Shia Islam, Rastafari, Baha'i, humanism, and others, and suggest how they can be taught within the classroom. I'm currently writing a series of 6 books for Bloomsbury, so that's the same publisher as Harry Potter, so I'm very excited. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to sell as much, but it's a series of books about the different religions of the world as well. And then my latest role that goes along all of those, I'm chair of a charity called Freedom Declared Foundation. And this is a charity that has been established in the UK to promote freedom of religion and belief. And it isn't a faith-based charity. There's lots of people who are on the board, and we look at all religion and non-religion as well and how that's there. So tonight's kind of a culmination of all of those different interests and what we look at. So that's me. So let's not make this about me. So when we consider what the freedom of religion and belief is, I think we have to refer back to the Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his or her, that's an anachronism, isn't it, religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community, with others and in public or private, to manifest his or her religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So this was after the end of the Second World War. So for the last, actually, I'm getting really old now, aren't I? So for maybe the last 70 years, that has been enshrined. And there have been elements of that throughout British history: freedom of religion, freedom of belief, freedom of conscience, and the right to change your belief or religion. And that's at the heart, really, of lots of different freedoms. There are three, for me, core aspects. So as you can see, there's the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. There shouldn't be any laws that stop someone having the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. They should be able to believe as they choose, have the freedom to change religion or belief, and then also to manifest our religion or to practice their religion. Now, we will discuss later about whether there is any possibility that the government or anybody else can restrict elements of religious freedom. So I don't think, from my perspective, it's an absolute right. It nearly is, but there are elements of freedom of religion and belief that I think can be limited under certain circumstances. And we'll see whether, and we'll also discuss how well the UK government does it, because that's one of the things. There's a number of charities and there's a number of organizations and there's an all-party parliamentary group, and they explore freedom of religion and belief, but they explore it outside of the UK. So they look at, well, how's India doing? How's China doing? And that's important, but they kind of fail to look inward, and we'll look at that a little bit as well. So last year, that all-party parliamentary group on international freedom talked about, well, what's religious freedom like around the world? And scarily, they concluded almost 75% of the world's population live in countries with high levels of government restrictions on freedom of religion or belief. Now, I think it's important for me to make clear at this point, we're not just talking about religion, we're talking about belief as well. So there are non-religious approaches to life. So within the UK, there is a large organization called Humanists UK, who adopt a non-religious worldview. And certainly within, for example, when I teach, over the last few years, we have changed focus from teaching religion to teaching religion and worldviews, because we want to be as inclusive as possible and allow people to feel represented. And one of the most important things, I think, in teaching religious education is for everybody to have a voice. And one of the things that I often say with regards to my own children is, until very, very recently, all of them have gone through school and never heard their faith mentioned. Now, they've survived, they're well adjusted. Well, three of them, no, I'm joking. They're well adjusted, they're nice people. So they've not suffered, but I think it's a travesty, really, that they've not really come across. And so when we look at the various things to do with teaching and representation, we need to be very conscious that we are looking at religion and worldviews, and it's not just about different things. Okay, so this article then goes on, or this report goes on to mention all kinds of things. So it's not limited to any one region, it's not limited to any one form of religion. And then they list Shia Muslims in Bahrain, Baha'is and Zoroastrians in Iran, Christians across large swathes of the Middle East, Sufi Muslims from the Sunni tradition in Somalia, atheists in Indonesia, Falun Gong practitioners in China, Buddhists in Tibet, Jewish people in Europe, and Hindus in Pakistan. It's a global concern that affects the full range. So there are, I think, much worse things going on in other countries with regards to freedom of religion and belief than there is in the UK. So I need to mention that up front, because although I'm going to focus mainly on religious freedom in the UK, that's not to ignore that there are huge abuses going on around the world. So just a couple of those. Oh, this is a report that was published this week from OSCE, and it's talking about the instances of hate crime around the world. And if you look at the numbers, it kind of goes from the most hate crimes, and I don't mean down to the least, but kind of goes down. And if you look, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, as anti-Muslim, and other motive based on religion and belief. So there's a lot of hate crimes that may not be being categorized as hate crimes actually happening around the world. So this is an example of one. It's the Yezidis. So this is a group who are being heavily persecuted and whose women are being kidnapped and are used as a weapon of war. And so we look at the freedom of religion and belief that Yezidis have, and it's horrendous. And so we need, I think, and everybody around the world needs to speak up, and there's a Free Yezidis kind of hashtag, but a hashtag isn't enough. People need to be doing things to actually raise the profile, raise the plight, and actually fight against what's going on that subjugates Yezidis and makes them, well, it's not even not have freedom of religion and belief, because they don't have that, but it's the persecution that they suffer as well. Another group, and I never know how to say this, but I've been told it's Uyghurs in China, so Uyghur Muslims in China, who are being, again, heavily subjugated. You will see the group of men who have been put into camps and are being re-educated. Things that perhaps we read about in history books to do with Stalinist Russia, with re-education camps, we're looking at things that are happening in China today. And I think that because China is quite a big trading partner with countries around the world, then it may be that that's one reason why the plight of the Uyghurs are not on a bigger conversation and not part of a bigger conversation. Ahmadiyya Islam. Now, Ahmadiyya Islam, for many Muslims, for Sunnis and Shias, are not seen to be Muslims because so Muslims generally believe that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. And so in that interpretation, he is the last of the prophets. Ahmadiyya Islam believes that in the 19th century, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad was another prophet. Now, he's not a prophet in the same way as Muhammad, who was a law-bearing prophet, but he was a non-law-bearing prophet who came to remind people of Muhammad's teachings. So he's kind of part of Muhammad's message. But because of him, many Muslims see Ahmadiyya Muslims to be non-Muslim. And what's really scary, because I think people, this sounds terrible, people are free to draw the boundaries of their religion wherever they want. But by the same token, Ahmadiyya Muslims are also able to draw the boundaries where they want as well. So they are Muslim by their own self-definition. And if you meet Ahmadiyya Muslims, certainly they are some of the most practicing Muslims that you will meet. But Pakistan has certain ordinances in its constitution. In fact, Ordinance 20 in 1984 was added, which effectively restricted the self-identification and religious practice of Ahmadiyya Muslims. What this means is that they're not allowed to call themselves Muslims. They're not allowed to call their places of worship mosques. And they're not allowed to use any of kind of the terminology. And essentially, there's a blasphemy law that is specifically focused on Ahmadiyya Islam. And it suggests they're not Muslim and that they pose as Muslims, and they are punished. It's punishable by imprisonment and fines as well. So I imagine that. So in some ways, when I picture Ahmadiyya Islam, it kind of occupies a similar space to Latter-day Saints within Christianity. So there are some people, because I do not believe in the Trinity, as Father, Son, Holy Ghost, homoousios, that I am not a Christian. But most people say, but it's fine, you consider yourself to be a Christian and you live your life as well as you can according to Christ's teaching. So I've never been persecuted for that. But Ahmadiyya Muslims within Pakistan are, and that meant that they had to move their headquarters to London. So we have all of these things, and these are just 3 examples that are happening around the world that shows that we don't have freedom of religion and belief that is happening. And if that report is to be believed, and I don't doubt it, 75% of the world's countries have some interference with regards to religion and belief. As the UK, I think we need to have the gold standard. So if we're going to tell people that you need to have freedom of religion and belief, and we need to be talking to people, and we do, there is an ambassador for the freedom of religion and belief that from the UK government. So we are talking to people about the importance of freedom of religion and belief. Then I think it's important that we actually exercise that, and we have that within our country. And for the most part, we do. But I'm going to share some examples that suggest that everything may not be quite as rosy as we have thought until we stop and think about what's going on. So we have a responsibility, first and foremost, to look inward before we start telling other people. It's like I'm regularly asked to speak on certain topics. And if I think back over the last 25 years, I have only ever refused to speak once. And that's because I was being asked to speak on healthy lifestyles. And look at me, I'm fairly chunky, to say the least. And I would stand at the front and tell people that they need to, no, I'm not going to stand at the front and tell people that they need to eat healthily, they need to exercise every day. I would be a hypocrite. I recognize that I should, but I don't think I can speak to that from a position of authority, because I don't do that for myself. And so if we are to, I suppose, lecture the world on freedom of religion and belief, then we need to be doing the very best that we can. So are we, I guess, is the question. Well, let's look at this. This is only one example. This is a headline. Sorry, Ben, I'm not supposed to go that way, am I? Anger after 5-year-old Sikh boy had his sacred hair cut with scissors in assault in Southeast London school. Now, the headline could have been better, but this is at least the second episode of this I've seen this year. And there was one, what's the top knot called, Sukhbir? Jury. And so that was ripped off a child a couple of weeks ago. And so in schools, there is religion-based bullying that is happening. And we'll talk about that and whether that's an issue of freedom of religion and belief in a moment. This is an example. So was it Peter Amos, who was the MP who recently died? I've forgotten his first name. Anybody remember? So the MP who recently was murdered. A Catholic priest showed up and the policeman didn't allow him in to give him the last rites. Now, the person was already in custody, so there wasn't an issue there. There were issues surrounding contamination of a crime scene, but the reason that he was refused was that the police or the policeman didn't see its importance. Now, I'm not Catholic, and last rites isn't important for me, but for the MP, it will have been, because he was a very practicing Catholic. And so it's raised an issue within Parliament now as to whether there should be an act that allows those who are dying to receive the visitation. And I guess I'll come on to that, but that's also been raised with COVID. And maybe there are issues of public safety, and we'll discuss those later. But I know for part of COVID, I was the bishop of my local church, and I couldn't go into hospitals. Before that, just a couple of months before that, sorry to use you as an example, Dorothy, my mother-in-law was in hospital, and I wasn't, and as a family, we weren't allowed to visit. Fortunately, I was her bishop, so I was allowed to pop in and say hello. So that was there, and that was always there. But then when COVID struck, ministers stopped being allowed to go in. So is that an issue of freedom of religion? Sorry, this is very small, but this is just a report that Islamophobic attacks have surged in England and Wales. So they are on the increase. West Ham fans sing anti-Semitic song to a Jewish passenger on a plane. And sometimes I think with regards to religious persecution or religious bullying or religious discrimination, it's to do with when people get into a group. Because some people don't do it on their own, but if they're in a group, they just kind of naturally go along. This is an example, sorry, of a synagogue that is being daubed with Nazi symbols, with swastikas even. while I was putting this together, Azim Rafiq, was giving evidence to the Houses of Parliament, to the Select Committee, about the racism that he had faced within cricket as a whole and Yorkshire cricket more narrowly. And he remembers an example at the age of 15, as a 15-year-old Muslim being held down by adults while an adult poured wine down his throat. That is, yes, it's racist, but it's also, it's not a phrase, religionist as well. So you might look at those, I think, and think, well, those are all individual acts. So what, in some ways, does that have to do with freedom of religion and belief? Well, let's look at some other things. So I interviewed this gentleman the other week, Rabbi Herschel Gluck. He's an Orthodox Jewish man. And the reason I was interviewing him was to find out his views on freedom of religion and belief in the UK. And the conversation that we had was, what are some examples of where perhaps that hasn't happened? And he talked about anti-Semitism. And then I asked him if enough was done to combat anti-Semitism within the UK in terms of its laws and structures and everything else. And the thing that he raised was, well, we're very good at talking about how anti-Semitism is wrong. But I think some people talk about it so that they're seen to be talking about it. Very similar, in fact, if we go back to Azim Rafiq, his teammates, who some of whom have been accused of racism, were those people who were wearing T-shirts that said, "End racism." So Rabbi Herschel suggested that actually we might be good about saying this is wrong, but are we doing that for kind of people to just recognize how good we are because we condemn this? But actually, is there anything within our systems that mean that actually it's not done an awful lot about? So let's look at some other headlines. And these are some with regards to how well institutions within the UK do. Now, there was a big push, and I know eventually it got cancelled. There was a big push last year to open up for Christmas, and everything was focused on Christmas, forgetting that the day before Eid was to start, there was a sudden shutdown, a sudden lockdown. There was no consideration, as there was for Christians at Christmas, for what Eid means to Muslims. And I'll maybe talk about that in a moment. We also have inequality in the UK with regards to humanist weddings. So last year I mentioned, I performed a wedding for my daughter, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and I was able to perform that wedding. It was never a question, but if I'm a humanist, my wedding is not recognized if I have a humanist service. I can go to a registry office and have a civil service, but I can't have a humanist wedding. And because I can't, you know, when they opened up again for COVID and 15 people were allowed at a wedding, well, because a humanist wedding was counted as a get-together rather than a wedding, only 6 people were allowed. So it kind of exacerbated the discrimination that humanists face in terms of their wedding ceremonies. Now, I'm not a humanist, and I don't want a humanist wedding, but I think I'm concerned because, well, they're not. And it is a recognized belief system. Some people think I have a hobby horse, and I have a number of them. So this is from the government. Faith leaders and government have agreed to develop a plan to enable the phased and safe reopening of places of worship when the evidence shows it is the right time to do so, Community Secretary Robert Jenrick confirmed. This follows the first virtual meeting of the new Places of Worship Task Force, which includes leaders and representatives from all the major faiths. Now, my issue, well, there's a number of issues, is the word major. That suggests that there's minor. Now, there's majority, there's large, there's small. But essentially, Robert Jenrick met with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Catholic Archbishop from London, I've forgotten who he is, so I apologize, a Sikh leader, a Jewish leader, and a Hindu leader. There was no Buddhist leader in there, and there were no other denominations from Christianity or from any other group except for Catholic and Anglican. And from Shia, and not from Shia, from Islam, there was just a Sunni representative. And actually, from what I understand, the person that they chose to represent the Sikh community in the first instance wasn't very representative of the faith community. It was just somebody that they knew through business. And so they chose somebody through that. And so they were seen to be having conversations, but in some ways not with all people. And so when we see, for example, the COVID restrictions that are developed, sometimes it doesn't take into consideration practices that are not within their immediate vision. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So, oh, that was the same thing. And then there's another example. So when lockdown happened, and again, you may disagree, so it's absolutely fine. So when lockdown happened, weddings were cancelled. I had lots of conversations with political leaders, and they could not understand why it was important for a wedding to happen. Yes, they understood it as a celebration, but Abby and Ethan, whose picture you see on the screen, and I have to show off my other children as well at the same time, were unable to start their life together because they were unable to get married. Now, we had other friends who were delaying their weddings, and that was fine because they lived together. And so they weren't delaying starting their life together and everything else. But whoever I spoke to in local government or national government, they didn't click that this was an issue of religion. That actually, by delaying weddings, and we were offering to just have the smallest wedding possible, that it was a religious issue. They just saw it as, well, you can't have the party, so that's what we're worried about. Well, actually, no. They can't start their life together until that happens. And then there's other issues. So one of the first things that happened in COVID was churches were shut, or places of worship were shut, and singing was banned. Now, if you're in my congregation, that's a good thing because you don't want to hear me sing. But if you go to Kirtan within a Gurdwara, well, that's the main focus of some worship. And when they shut places of worship down, I don't think they considered. They knew what happened in Anglicanism, and they knew what happened in Roman Catholicism. But anything outside of that, and this is shown by some of the guidance that they gave around baptisms, which was they would focus on the baptisms that happened in the Church of England or within Roman Catholicism, but they never really addressed until much later issues surrounding baptism by immersion, and also mikvahs and so on, which happen in Jewish synagogues or shuls. So we have all kinds of things. None of these, I think, were targeted at restricting freedom of religion and belief. They didn't set out to say, okay, we don't like the Sikhs, so what we're going to do is we're going to stop singing. Or we don't like the Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we're not going to allow them to baptize. I don't think they set out to do that, but it was an unintended consequence of the guidance that they were giving and not being aware of everything else that was around. It was only their religious literacy that guided them, really. And part of that as well was shown because in the midst of this, I think it was recognized by government that they weren't doing the greatest job at consulting. So they issued a consultation on issues of religion and belief within the local communities. By the way, we're still waiting for this report to come out a year later, but anyway, that's by the by. And they defined religion this way. So, religion is a particular and organized system of faith and worship in a supreme being or entity or supreme being or entities. Okay, issue there doesn't include Buddhists, who for the most part do not believe in a supreme God or a deity. There are other issues with their definition. The way that they kind of highlight typically places of worship, a hierarchy, have a creed, scriptures, ancient texts. Now, I can give you a 2-hour lecture on what the word religion means and how it's a colonial imposition on Sikhi, on Buddhism, on Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma, but we 200, 300 years ago, imposed what religion is. And most people who study religion and talk about religion now recognize that we need to break out of these kind of constraints of what a religion is and that definition. But what Colin Bloom does, who's the government's faith advisor, is he brings it back to that colonial understanding of religion. And he excludes not just humanists, but Buddhists, and also kind of others who perhaps don't quite fit that structure. And also with regards to temples, with the best will in the world, as a Latter-day Saint, I do worship in a temple. We have a church, which we're in tonight. We also have a temple, one of which is in Chorley, one of which is in London or East Grinstead. Sikhs worship in a Gurdwara. Hindus worship in a mandir. Buddhists worship in viharas in the UK. So they're using terminology that anglicizes what's going on. And so we have to be very clear. I think we need to use the terminology that is used within those faith communities. So what's this got to do with anything? Sorry, I do waffle on a bit. I read a book, you'll be pleased to know, just the one, by a man called Darren McGarvey. And it was really interesting for me because Darren McGarvey writes about a place called Pollock, which is in Glasgow. And he writes about it in the same time as I lived there as a missionary for my church. But I don't recognize his view. I knew there was deprivation, but I didn't recognize his view. And that's not because he's wrong, it's because I couldn't experience what he was experiencing. I was there just as a visitor, someone who was allegedly going to help. But what he talks about is he talks about power dynamics within the community. And this is something that I talk about a lot when I talk about smaller religions. And he says at the bottom that the decisions that affect your life are being taken by a bunch of other people somewhere else who are deliberately trying to conceal things from you. So this was his feeling, a belief that you are excluded from taking part in the conversation about your own life. This belief is deeply held by many people in many communities, and there's a very good reason for it. It's true. Now, what he's saying is that if you are in a minority, then the ruling class, and I know this is quite a Marxist view of life, but the ruling class or whoever that is, or the people who are in charge, are taking decisions sometimes for the best of reasons, and they're trying to do the very best they can by seeing what is needed and then trying to solve that need. But what they're doing is they're making those decisions without consulting the people who they should be consulting with. So having that as a background, and I will come back to that in a moment, we then ask the question, should there be limits to religious freedom? So religious freedom is this right, and we've said, or I've said, it's really important, but should there be limits? Is this something that we should do? So recently there was, so actually I'll come back to recently in a moment. So there are permissible restrictions according to the UN. And essentially, if we look at the second one, the limitations must be necessary to protect one of the finite lists of legitimate purposes: protection of public safety, public order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedom of others. So the nature of the restriction must not be disproportionate to the specific need. So the COVID restrictions that we had, I think, are justifiable to some extent under public safety, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So this is a recent case where EU companies can ban employees wearing headscarves, court rules. Now that's a bit of a misleading headline, if I'm honest, because it's not just about headlines. It's not just about headscarves, excuse me, about the hijab. It's about any religious symbol. So by EU law, a company can say, you are not allowed to wear any religious symbols. So that would include a turban, it would include a hijab, it would include a cross, it would include anything that is considered to be a religious symbol. The way that it's been interpreted and the way that people have seen this is that it's specifically targeting Muslim women. But in doing so, it's kind of made a bigger law that actually affects others. So is this law right? is this law an acceptable restriction of freedom of religion and freedom of religion and belief? Well, the EU has decided that yes, it is. It's fine because it's not targeting one specific group. Now, I'll leave you. I mean, you can probably tell what I think, but it's an interesting discussion. I also think this is one area that I do think there should be a restriction on religious freedom. Generally speaking, FGM or female genital mutilation is a cultural practice, but there are a couple of religions around the world who would see it to be a religious practice. This is an act of patriarchal violence. It's horrendous. It's against the law. So there are specific laws in Britain against this. As a teacher, if I find out that someone is being abused, I refer it to a safeguarding officer who then speaks to people far more qualified to find out what they need to do, talk to social services and everything else. If I discover that someone has had female genital mutilation, it is my responsibility to go straight to the police and say, this has happened. There's no middle man or woman involved. It is an act, and so I would say that yes, definitely, there has to be some restriction on freedom of religion and belief because this is causing harm. And so we cannot use religion as a justification for acts of violence, for discrimination, for all kinds of, we can't use that because it is affecting someone else. But we can use certain things to restrict certain elements of religious freedom. And that becomes a big, messy area. Because of things like FGM, it then gets into messier areas where other things are able to be restricted. And the government did some things, I think, to restrict certain elements of religious freedom during COVID that I think went a step too far. And certainly in Scotland, there was a court case brought against the government because they had restricted the numbers in churches and other places of worship, but it was a Christian organization that brought the court case, but they didn't restrict their numbers in cinemas or in bars or in other places. So there was seen to be a double standard, and the Court of Human Rights kind of ruled against the Scottish government. But it's interesting for us to consider whether some of these restrictions went too far. And yes, there is a need for protecting public safety, but can we trust people to actually abide by those and do different things? That is a question. So I suppose the question is, with 20 minutes remaining, is what do we do about this? What is the way forward? Because there are, and let me just share with you this, there's individual and there's institutional issues. So individual issues are people by their own choices persecuting people, bullying people because of their religious belief or their non-religious belief. But then there's the institutional ones as well. So this is the laws that are established by the government. This is the law or the rules established by companies. And so we have both of these that need addressing, because there's institutional issues, and this has been shown recently, and I know it's issues of race, but with regards to Yorkshire Cricket Club. So there were individuals who were doing certain things, but then we find out that actually nothing has been done, and there was almost a tacit, not approval, but turning the other way within the cricket club itself. And so the individual and the institutional go together. So what do we do? Well, of course, the country needs to have laws and structures in place, and companies need to have all of those things in place as well. But actually, I think freedom of religion and belief begins with the individual, because the community or the structure is made up of those individuals as well. Oh, well, there was sound, I forgot that one. So often we talk about tolerance as what we need to be doing. So we need more tolerance in this country. I disagree, and I'll explain why in a moment. Because I think tolerance isn't enough. Sorry, Kevin, I tolerate Manchester United fans. Oh, suck beer as well. I tolerate Manchester United fans. I recognize their right to exist, but I really do not want anything to do with them. Thank you very much indeed. You stay over there waving your red flags, singing your songs about your wonderful manager, and I'll stay over here. Thank you very much. But I respect your right to be able to do that because you're deluded. But that aside, and I do apologize if you're a United fan. I really do apologize. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you're a United fan. So what we need to do, and the top quote is from John Locke, who was a philosopher who talked about tolerance a little bit. And I quite like his definition, which is, therefore, peace, equity, and friendship are always mutually to be observed without any pretense of superiority or jurisdiction over one another. Whether the man is Christian or pagan, he is to be kept safe from violence and injury. Indeed, we should go beyond mere justice, adding benevolence and charity. The gospel commands this, reason urges it, and it is favored by the natural fellowship we are born into. So it's about exercising charity and love. It's not about putting up with. One of the leaders of our church, D. Todd Christofferson, said, a robust freedom is not merely what political philosophers have referred to as the negative freedom to be left alone, however important that may be. Rather, it's a much richer positive freedom, the freedom to live one's religion or belief in a legal, political, and social environment that is tolerant, he used that phrase, respectful and accommodating of diverse beliefs. We need to go far beyond tolerance. We need to understand. We need to respect. We need to love. So yes, there will be areas of disagreement that we have, and that's absolutely fine. I am regularly meeting with people who have different religious beliefs to mine. That isn't an issue in our relationship. We can have open discussions about religion, and I tend to have tons of discussions about religion, mainly because that's what I spend my days talking about. But we can have those discussions, and it's important to have them. But it's not about just saying, well, okay, Tesco's have Diwali cards this year, isn't that nice? It's about maybe sending one of those Diwali cards. It's about respecting and celebrating all of those things that kind of happen. David Cameron suggested, and there is some problem with his language, but under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we've encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and apart from the mainstream. We failed to provide a vision of society to which they feel they want to belong. Now, there's issues with day and everything else, but essentially what he's saying is people too often live in silos. So, and I'll admit, if I look at the vast majority of my friends, okay, or two of them, then they're mainly Latter-day Saints because that's my faith community, and that's as it should be. But if all I do is clump together and I don't make friends of other faiths and none, then what am I doing about involving? I'll moan that there's this horrible world out there that doesn't value my values. Well, am I involved in that? Am I doing anything about that? Interesting. It's always weird how prescient The Simpsons is. So that's the picture that's behind this of this quote. And it's a time when the residents of Springfield and Shelbyville decide to build a wall between each other because they hate each other, they don't like each other. So we'll build this wall and it will keep those horrible people out of here. But then the wall falls into disrepair and they agree that they need to fix it together because we need this wall. And then they discover, actually, as they're working together, that they have more in common than they think. So the one example that's probably not very good is Homer discovers another man who hates his children just as much as Homer hates Bart and Lisa. So they kind of bond over a dislike of their children, which isn't the greatest, but they find the things that they have in common. And I think that's one of the real benefits of religious freedom and belief and interfaith and everything else is working together for a common goal. And there are lots of people in the world who have similar values and similar concerns to us, whoever those us is. And I think it's really important. And so going back to Darren McGarvey, he says, enthusiasm to take part and be active in communities quickly dissipates when people realize the local democracy isn't really designed with them in mind, that it's designed primarily so that people from outside the community can retain control of it over the heads of those who live there. So I know I've been in meetings and I've given evidence to certain commissions, and it's very obvious that I'm not being listened to. And because I'm petulant, I will give up and I will stop trying to contribute because no one's listening. Or I'm being treated with tolerance, which is, okay, we'll listen to it and then just completely go on and ignore. So eventually I stop trying. And that's me not being very nice, I think. But it's, and this is what Darren McGarvey is saying, is whoever we are and the structures of society need to involve all people and listen to those with the quietest voices as well as those with the loudest voices. I think Twitter's a very good example of that. Sometimes the loudest people don't know what they're talking about. And the little voices get missed. And so we need to listen to those. Okay, this is a task. If you've been in a workshop with me before, you may have done this before. This is a sculpture called The Cathedral by Rodin. Okay, so I would like you, Ben, no cheating because I know you've done this. I would like you to recreate with your hands this sculpture. Can you do that? Elder Bosun, you're not doing very well there. Sister, you're not that great. Okay, there's a few people in the room. Sorry, this is really bad for people at home. Sukbir is doing something. Who knows what that is? No one's quite worked it out yet. Elder and Sister Harrison, you should be able to work this out. You love each other so much. There we go. Yes. It needs two people to recreate the cathedral. Oh, thank you, Peter. Yes. So sometimes we try and do everything by ourselves. And that's my immediate reaction. I'm trying to recreate this and I haven't got two right hands. I've got a left hand and a right hand. So I need two right hands to create this. And that's a really good metaphor, I think, for the way that we live in society, is we can't survive on our own, whether we are an institution, a religious group, or an individual. We need others. And in the words of John Donne, isn't it? No man is an island. And what we need to recognize is even if we are in a position of power, that gives us a greater responsibility, not something that we can just sit back and kind of chill and be happy with what we've got. Because as Dr. King says, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. The agony of the poor enriches the rich. We are inevitably our brother's keeper because we are our brother's brother. Whatever affects one indirectly or one directly affects all indirectly. And then he says this. So obviously, America is this land of milk and honey. But he said, yeah, I'm not even commenting. But then he says this, he says, let us be dissatisfied until the rat-infested, vermin-filled slums will be a thing of a dark past and every family will have a decent sanitary house in which to live. Let us be dissatisfied until the empty stomachs of Mississippi are filled and the idle industries of Appalachia are revitalized. Let us be dissatisfied until our brothers of the third world of Asia, Africa, and Latin America will no longer be the victims of imperialist exploitation, but will be lifted from the long night of poverty, illiteracy, and disease. It's not enough that I am literate. I need to make sure that everybody else has that opportunity. So I think it places a greater responsibility. And one of our scriptures says, unto whom much is given, much is required. So it's not enough for us to get to a certain place and have certain rights. We need to make sure that everybody else has those rights. So 20 or 30 years ago, I started some research and I started looking at how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was represented in the classroom. And I was concerned because it wasn't. And over the last 20 or 30 years, I'm now in a position as a professor of religious education who writes books and who teaches and lectures widely to make that well known and to help others put that into the classroom. But you know what? That's not the only thing that I do. I talk about Ahmadiyya Islam. I talk about Rastafari. I talk about smaller groups that are not represented, because it's not enough that I just do it for the things I'm concerned about in my own faith, but we need to look at the impact it has on others. And this was one of my favorite quotes from the first prophet of my church, Joseph Smith. He said this: the saints can testify whether I am willing to lay down my life for my brethren. or sisters. If it's been demonstrated that I have been willing to die for a Mormon, I'm bold to declare before heaven that I'm just as ready to die in defending the rights of a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or a good man of any other denomination. For the same principle which would trample upon the rights of the Latter-day Saints would trample upon the rights of the other denomination, or of any other denomination who may be unpopular and too weak to defend themselves. It's a love of liberty which inspires my soul, civil and religious liberty to the whole of the human race. Love of liberty was diffused into my soul by my grandfathers while they dandled me on their knees. And shall I want friends? No. This is kind of my approach to things, is it's not enough for me to have rights. Everybody has to have those same rights. Otherwise, it's pointless. So yes, I may, as someone who has religious freedom, be okay. I'm not persecuted. I'm not treated particularly differently. But there are people in this country and there are people around the world who are. And we need to be very careful at the erosion of fundamental human rights for some groups. So this may be controversial. The government are considering at the moment a bill that would change immigration law to stop people converting religion or changing religion. Why? Because of the bomb that went off in Liverpool on Sunday. Now, don't get me wrong, that was horrendous. It was disgusting. And as far as I'm aware, then it's possible, maybe even probable, that the gentleman or the man, I won't call him a gentleman, the man who did that then played the system. But because he played the system, does it mean that everybody else should not have the right to change their religion to whatever religion that might be? And so, no, I'm not justifying him in any way, shape, or form. But if other people are denied that same right, then is that an infringement of the Declaration of Human Rights and the freedom of religion and belief? And so therefore, okay, he might not be able to, or she might not be able to become a Christian or a Sikh or anything else for fear that they will game the system. But do we judge one person, or do we judge the whole community by the actions of one person? So, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, it's up for discussion, but it is a worrying thing. And so we need to be very, very aware of the rights. And so a number of years ago, I had someone knock on my door asking me to sign a petition because they were building a mosque around the corner. We had a very pleasant discussion. Well, it was a pleasant discussion from my side anyway. And it was essentially in my head, I'm thinking, well, if we wanted to build a temple or a church around the corner, I would not want someone to put this petition around. So no, I am not signing this petition. And in fact, I'm going to talk out against this petition. Now, the mosque wasn't built, but it's one of those things that we do need to consider. Caliph or Imam Ali in Islam, so either the fourth caliph or the first imam after Prophet Muhammad, said this. He said, remember that the citizens of the state are of two categories. They're either your brothers in religion or your equal in humanity. They're subject to infirmities and liable to commit mistakes. Some indeed do commit mistakes, but forgive them as you would like God to forgive you. Let your mind respect through your actions the right of God and the rights of man, and similarly persuade your companions and relations to do likewise. For otherwise you will be doing injustice to yourself and injustice to humanity. So, summary. I think we have individual responsibilities. I think we have institutional responsibilities as well, but the institutional ones are only going to change when the individuals change. So we need to be with others. We need to be with people who are different to us. We need to recognize the bias or the prejudice that we have, because we all have it, but we need to recognize that prejudice and work to overcome that. We need to listen and learn. I don't know what's good for certain groups, but I need to listen. As we've discussed Black Lives Matter and different things over the last few years, it's become very evident that I'm not about to tell someone what their experience is. I need to listen to what their experience is and be able to learn from those experiences. So just because I haven't experienced certain things doesn't mean that someone else hasn't. So what's interesting, and this goes for all groups, and so I presented some evidence to some commissioners on religious education, and one of them would not believe what I was saying because he was from a certain religion that didn't have to fight to have its voice heard. So he didn't believe what I was saying, and it's like, but that's my experience. I can provide different things that have happened, but he wouldn't. We need to, as individuals, protect the rights of others. We need to speak out against injustice, and we also need to consider the intentional and unintentional consequences of actions and words. So we have to consider the way that we talk to and about people. That's really key in all that we do. We extend the same rights, the same kind of care to others that we want extended to us. We have to do this. And I think certain people, and this is fine, people talk about religious freedom as being a legal right or a constitutional right or I don't know, an institutional right. Yeah, we'll go with that. But actually, it's more of a moral right. And as an individual, I have a responsibility to live that. Whether the laws of my country support it or not, it's my responsibility to live it. But you can see that most of the things on an institutional level are exactly the same as on an individual level. The two that I've added are to include all voices. I think it is accepted we include male and female voices within everything, men and women in all of our decision-making processes wherever we work. I assume that's taken for granted anyway. But do we do that for race? Do we do that for religion? Do we consider, well, because somebody needs a prayer room within our place of work, oh, well, it doesn't matter. He's just one person or she's just one person. But we need to include all voices. One of the things that I found as I've kind of talked about different things is that our young people, this sounds terrible, don't know the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. Some do, but not many do. And the idea that I'm sharing with regards to the Emperor's New Clothes is it took a child to point out, he's naked, he's not wearing any clothes. It took the smallest voice to actually recognize the issues. And so sometimes we dismiss the smallest voice and we actually need to use those. And then we need, the institutions need to address the injustice. So we can speak out as individuals against injustice, but we maybe not be able to do anything about it. But when we're in a company, we can address that injustice. So I remember at one of the schools that I worked in, there was a jewelry policy that said no jewelry at all, apart from a pair of studs. And there was a young man who'd been told to take off his kara or his steel bangle, which is a Sikh article of faith or one of the 5 Ks. And he came running down the corridor, burst into my lesson and said, "Sir, we need to talk. Mr. Such a body," and then he used not a very pleasant word. And it's like, okay, calm down. What's the matter? He's taken my car off me. You need to tell him that that's wrong. I said, yes, I really do. Do not use that word again. I will go and talk to him and we will change the jewelry. That is wrong. And so I was in a position of authority to be able to do something about it. In some areas we're not, but institutions need to address the injustice when those are raised. Okay, this is final. This is another sculpture. It's called Holy Ground, and it's symbolic of the burning bush where Moses took off his shoes. And I link it to a friend of mine's comment, Jeff Teese. He said, it's the space between us that constitutes holy ground, holiness being discovered through encounter. When we talk to people, between us there is a third space. There is a transformational third space where we can learn about each other, but we can learn about ourselves through this dialogue. And so for me, dialogue with other people and working with other people is not a threat, but it's an opportunity to learn more about them, but also to learn more about myself as I'm in dialogue with them. So we need definitely to work for freedom of religion and belief. Okay, any questions? Thank you very much, Sidney. Okay, any questions? No, sorry. Well, we've probably got about 20 minutes or so if we need it. If not, we can just go and get some biscuits from upstairs and do that. So that's absolutely great. Elder Harrison.
Do you see any overlap or intersection between supporting religious freedom, or promoting or advocating for religious freedom, and looking at immigration law and immigration policy? You see the overlap in that space?
Okay, so the question, just for people who are listening, so is there overlap between religious freedom and immigration law? Okay, so I think there's two answers to that, and it's yes and no. But in terms of no, immigration sometimes is made a religious issue because everybody seeking to come into the UK are Muslim. Well, no, they're not. And so sometimes the discussion around immigration policy focuses on certain groups of people. So it shouldn't. But then the other thing, when we look at asylum seekers, some of those are coming to our shores to escape religious persecution. And so we need to be fully cognizant as a country on the issues that are facing certain religious groups within Afghanistan with the takeover of the Taliban. We need to be aware of what's happening with Ahmadiyyas in Pakistan. We need to be aware of all of those reasons why people would want or be forced to move their entire home on their back into another country and go halfway around the world. So I think it shouldn't be, but I think it needs to be as well at the same time, because when we tar everybody kind of with the same brush, that's problematic. But when we kind of say, well, actually, we need to be familiar with the religious sensibilities, with the groups and everything else, so that we can actually understand the issues that they're facing. And also when we consider where we're housing people, the kind of facilities that we provide and everything else, they also need to be aware of religious sensitivities and provide places where people can freely practice their religion. I hope that answers your question. That's great. Thanks, Elder Harrison. Any other thoughts? Ben, do we have a chat on there that people can use, or? Okay, you may need to tell me what those are because I can't see the chat right now. Oh, no, I can. Don't worry. I could just need to press a button rather than be lazy and let you do it. Oh, no, I can't see it. You will only see. It will only come through to you. Kevin.
Just going back to the initial lockdown, major lockdown where everything was literally shut. And it's interesting as lockdown eased, things like showrooms were open before churches, chapels and places of worship, like order of priority. It suggests that the government didn't recognise people of faith are going to their mosque or church, help them in their well-being, not just faithful, spiritually, well-being side of that. That needs to be attended to. Not knowing what's happening down the road, have the government learned anything from that you're aware of, that if it was to be a major lockdown again, how that would affect our worship?
So the question is, has the government learned anything from the things that they did with COVID and that they got criticised for? I think there's two things. One is, and I'll repeat one of my issues with it, is that the government saw religion almost as an optional extra. For me, and this is one of the problems with the definition of religion. So every year I come to Manchester and I visit lots of different faith communities, including Suckbeer. And most people will say at the beginning of their talk to my students, will say, it's not a religion, it's a way of life. And that's the way I feel about my faith, is it's not a bolt on and bolt off thing that is kind of optional. It's woven into who I am. I am, first and foremost, a disciple of Jesus Christ. So that's part of who I am. And I don't think the government quite clicked, generally speaking, that happened. I mentioned I did an interview with Rabbi Herschel Gluck, A colleague of mine did an interview with Bishop John Keenan of Paisley. And what he said is actually the Scottish government regressed into the second lockdown. So in the first lockdown, they consulted. In the second lockdown, they didn't. So it's interesting. Has the government learned anything? Well, they've done this consultation about faith and belief, and I glibly said, and a year later, we're still waiting for it. But I think that perhaps highlights kind of its priority. They have just appointed a faith minister. So in Michael Gove's department, there is now a faith minister, who I believe is a lovely lady and hopefully will do things. But I'm not sure they still click. And by they, it's a communal thing, isn't it? That they still click what it is to be religious. But there are politicians who do, but sometimes they're the lone voice in the wilderness kind of thing. Go on. Wait and see. Yes, but hopefully we won't have to see again, because this is never going to happen again, and we won't have to go through this all over again. Sukbi.
Religious freedom to me has to come from the religions themselves. So I see very little of the highest religious leaders getting together and sending that message out. Is it me that I don't see that? Or do they actually do it? Oh, whoever the head of the different religions are, of course there are factions, I understand that. But yet I don't see those people getting together to send a message, because there's so much trouble, so many people dying. And I think that if the Pope said something, and if my faith said something about peace, unity, and respecting other religions and standing together, people certainly from my faith will listen.
Yeah, so just to repeat the question for others, it's a question about the highest religious leaders getting together and saying something. I think they do individually.
Yeah.
So I know the Pope said something. I know President Nelson, who's the head, not the head, Jesus Christ is the head of our church, who is the prophet of our church, kind of have stood up and they've said things. But together, I mean, for example, there's the Assisi declarations of I don't know how many years ago about the environment. And so that was a place where lots of religious leaders came together and they gave declarations together. So that happened 30 or 40 years ago, I think. I can't remember the year of it. So that did happen. So it's possible, but I don't think it does. And I think there's perhaps a number of reasons for that. And this is just me making stuff up, I guess. But when you're in a position of power, so let's say you're a really large religion, what benefit does it have for you to work with a smaller religion and give them voice within yours? Now that's horrendous, and I recognize that, but that might be the case. But it's important, just as you would expect the UN with representatives of all of the different nations to condemn things, then you would expect a group of religions to do the same. But it's interesting because if I use the UN as an example, the UN Security Council have only acted in war once in its entire history. And that's because Russia, America, the UK have a veto. So the only reason they acted in Korea is because Russia wasn't attending at that point. And so we have this group of people who are supposed to protect the world and speak out and do stuff, but the biggest voices have the veto. And so maybe it's about, sometimes if we get a big voice, we don't want to use it and maybe affect our position of power. Now, that might not be true, and I might be making stuff up, but I think there is a place for religious leaders to stand up and say, this is wrong, we need to do something about it.
Similarly, if you look at COP26, which just happened,
Yep.
to me, it's actually a universal thing.
Yep.
The environment itself. I didn't see very little about religion leaders coming together.
No, there were interfaith services and things in Glasgow, but yes, not religious people standing up and saying this, and it's the, as you say, it's the leaders who need to stand up. And maybe in some religions,
but in unity.
Yes.
They stand together, they seek, and they'd be so powerful, and I just can't understand why they don't do it.
maybe some believers, maybe some followers of religions would say, I can't believe that they're working with those. Those are, I don't know. Maybe they're just worried about the position. Kevin. Right.
Involved recently, and the church was part of that worldwide global gathering of church leaders. So it does happen on a global sense.
Yeah.
Can't say every religion, all the major, and a lot of the other
Please don't use that word. All the main, or the
Yeah,
bigger, all the bigger religions.
a lot of
All the bigger religions. Yeah, yeah.
global gathering
Yeah.
takes place.
So there are global gatherings, but it's then what they say and how they use that platform to actually speak out against injustice in the world. And that's really key. Any other questions, queries, moans, whinges? Mark?
Do you think government should stay out of religion? Because I'm thinking about a lot of those countries you quoted, where there's religious, lack of religious people. I think I suspect a lot of those countries where religions are more represented in the government than maybe one religion. So do you think government should be inherently non-religious? But
I mean, it's interesting because was it Alistair Campbell said, we don't do God. He was Tony Blair's spin doctor and said, we don't do God. And Archbishop Carey wrote a book. He was then Archbishop of Canterbury, wrote a book about God in the public square. I don't know why I said both of those things, but never mind. But essentially, I'm very positive about the influence of religion when it's done well. I think the problem is when it's done badly, then yes, it leads to intolerance. And I think there are some people who are so concerned to hold on tight and to hold on to their power that religion is something that they use to keep that power. And so it will almost play into the 80% of the country who are a certain religion. But I also think taking God out or taking religion out of the public square, I think is problematic. Because I think religion can do so much more. So if my religion motivates me, for example, to love other people, to treat other people respectfully, to argue for their rights, and I become a politician, and I'm not about to, then that's good. But I think we live in a country where that's frowned upon. So for example, Tim Farron, who was leader of the Liberal Democrats, he was unable to continue as leader of the Liberal Democrats because of his religious views. He didn't feel it was compatible. And I think that's worrying. I do agree that a large number of states who have a religious kind of government perhaps may be more prone to restricting the rights of others. But I think that's where it begins with the individual as well, is that we need to fight for people to have every right. And so it can be a positive or it can be a negative influence. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's negative, but in some cases, it's positive as well. So I'm sitting on the fence, but I think it can be very, very positive. Because I think my practice as a teacher is obviously influenced by who I am as a religious person, and the way that I teach and the way that I talk and everything else is influenced by that. So I think that should be the same for politicians. But I think it should be positive. But sometimes the cultural or the political issues take precedence, and I'm more concerned to hold on to my parliamentary seat than I am in saying what I actually think. So, and I'm not referring to anybody at all in that statement. Any other questions or queries? Thanks, Ben. Yes, I've forgotten your name. I'm sorry.
I just have a quick question about as students who are looking to be primary education teachers, we struggle a lot with with religious education in England and how it's very Christian and Anglican influence. And I was just wondering, based on your experience, if you could share anything about how to be more inclusive about world religions that aren't spoken about very regularly in the classroom, and how to be more inclusive to raise children are able to be with everything.
Okay, so there's a book you can buy, but we won't go there. But essentially, so the question is about religious education and how we can make our classrooms more inclusive as teachers. And I think there's one very small thing that we can do. Well, no, I'll go with two. First one is the language that we use. And one of the things that I often talk about is that religion is messy. And what I mean by that is there's lots of different ways to be Muslim, there's lots of different ways to be Christian, there's lots of different ways to be Sikh, lots of different ways to be Buddhist. It's like the story of the blind man and the elephant, where if the elephant is Christianity, there's 6 blind men who are looking at it, well, not looking at it actually, and they're saying, okay, the first one's saying, well, it's hard, it's rough, it's like a brick wall, because he's feeling the side. The second one is feeling the trunk, so it's like a snake, and they're all discussing the different parts based on their own experience. When we teach religions as a whole, so when we teach Christianity or Buddhism or whatever else, we need to recognize the diversity, and we do that in the primary school first and foremost by the words many, most, and some. So many Christians believe this, most Christians believe this. So I'm making up numbers, but 95% of the world's Christians believe in the Trinity. So my children have attended school, and one of them told me this, and she's at the back of a classroom, and her teacher says, all Christians believe in the Trinity. Now, she was brave enough to put her hand up and say, actually, miss, no, they're not. I'm a Christian and I don't believe in the Trinity. And her teacher knew me. I said, oh, yes, sorry, Eleanor. Sorry, I shouldn't use the name. Sorry, Eleanor, I forgot. And so that was there. And so using many, most, and some get you out of that. So, for example, Muslims pray 5 times a day. Well, not if you're a Shia Muslim. You pray 3 times a day. You offer through 5 prayers, but you pray 3 times a day. Now, how do you know that as a teacher? Well, you don't, possibly. So what you do is you say many, most, and some for most things. The other thing as well, I think, is if you look at your local community or you look at your school and you know that there are people of different faiths or none, then we include their voices in our classroom. Now, not the individual children, but if we have Baha'i or if we have humanist children, then when we're talking about rites of passage, then we would include a rite of passage from Baha'i or from humanism. And it's interesting, there's a lady called Linda Rudge. She wrote a very famous article called I Am Nothing. And she tells her story of going into a classroom, looking at children's work, and it said, my name is James, I am a Christian. My name is Sukbir, I'm just using names that are in the room. I am a Sikh. My name is George, I am nothing. And that's not what he meant, but essentially he needed to see himself represented. And that's a really big issue, is about representation within the classroom. So it's many, most, and some is the easiest thing, but also representation as appropriate within the classroom, because the demands on the curriculum are so massive that we do have to make selections in what we teach. But thank you for that question, that's really helpful. One more question maybe? Or stunned silence and we'll get biscuits. Yes, Elder. Oh, sorry, Cedric, I'll then come to you. You're on my blind side, sorry.
It's just a question for us is go out and spread specific, beliefs, what we believe is what can we do to interact with other people to kind of incorporate.
Okay, so the question is from one of our missionaries here, who their specific role is to teach and testify of Jesus Christ and to help people come to Christ. So what can they do when they meet people of other faiths? And I think this isn't to take away from your role, because that is your role. That's what you are called to do. As I mentioned before, I have a son who's doing that. But I think it's about being respectful for other religions. So I think it's really important, and this is going to sound rather glib, when you are talking to other people about their faith, sometimes we talk about them in a caricatured way. So we may have heard something about, I don't know, Muslims or about Buddhists, and we talk about them in a glib way. Or we are very dismissive of what they think. So if someone is, and this happens from religion to religion, so if a Buddhist is trying to convert a Jew, or if a Latter-day Saint is trying to convert someone, what you don't do is go in and say, do you know what, your mother's ugly, let me tell you about mine. But that's sometimes what we do, is your religion's kind of, and I had a teacher who did this once. He drew a white bunny on the board and said, let's talk about superstition. Okay, we know what superstition is, now let us talk about Hinduism. It's like, those two things do not link together. So it's about being respectful and understanding, and actually listening as well. Because sometimes one of the things I think as a missionary I was focused on was teaching and telling them everything about me and about my faith. But actually, people will know how much you care about how much you mission, how much you listen to them as well. So I think it's just about being respectful and being understanding, because just as you feel about your faith is how they feel about theirs as well. Sorry, and the final question will be from Cedric.
Cynthia and I, and possibly others in the room, members of our SACRA,
Yep.
Standing Advisory Committee on Membership, Manchester one is currently commissioning for anything that we can do.
Okay, so the question is that SACRA write agreed syllabuses or the content for religion in religious education in schools. So how can we influence that? I think just by having your voice heard. So I mentioned before that the loudest voices seem to dominate. And actually some of the loudest voices don't have good things. I mean, sometimes they do have really good things to say, but sometimes I know what I got told off once by my wife. Is she on? Doesn't look like she is, so I can tell this story. Oh, Ruth is, oh, quick. So we were having a conversation with some friends, and there was, this gentleman was a specific type of Christian, and I had been told that I should